Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Simon Marks, and these are the top headlines of this Monday. A day of strikes is underway in Belgium over the cost of living. Brussels Airport cancelled all departing flights on Monday, and many bus services across the country have also been halted after inflation hit 9% this month. Russia's foreign ministry is demanding that Lithuania lift its restrictions on the railway transportation of EU-sanctioned goods to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. Germany plays down expectations that a leaders' meeting at the NATO summit in Bavaria next week will sign off on the applications for NATO membership by Finland and Sweden, though Berlin says agreement is still in sight. A Japanese court rules that the country's failure to recognize same-sex marriage is constitutional. The ruling is a big setback for activists. And dams and taps in northern Mexico are running dry after historic water shortages due to extreme temperatures. Over half of Mexico is currently facing moderate to severe drought conditions, according to the country's Federal Water Commission. We begin today with the inflationary scourge hitting the United States. The war in Ukraine has, of course, triggered price rises worldwide, but now economists are predicting the growing likelihood that a recession will hit the United States within the next 12 to 18 months. More than 60% of CEOs surveyed by the Wall Street Journal last week said they expect the country will enter a recession. That means they think there will be 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth within the next year and a half. They cited a variety of reasons for that viewpoint, including higher borrowing costs, a blistering existing pace of inflation, supply chain problems, and the global rise in commodity prices. A separate poll of 53 economists conducted this month after the Federal Reserve hiked interest rates here in order to fight inflation showed that many expect unemployment will rise as the Fed continues to raise interest rates. They forecast unemployment rising from 3.75% at the end of this year to 4.2% by the end of 2023. Economists still expect the economy to grow for the rest of this year, but they have slashed their growth projections. On average, they see GDP rising only 1.3% in the fourth quarter. Recent data suggests the US economy is starting to slow down under the combined weight of soaring inflation and climbing interest rates. Mortgage rates are also at the highest level they've been since the year 2008. Despite the gloomy projections, the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen echoed President Biden on Sunday, insisting that recession in the US is not inevitable.
I expect the economy to slow. It's been growing at a very rapid rate as the labor market has recovered and we have reached full employment. It's natural now that we expect a transition to steady and stable growth. But I don't think a recession is at all inevitable. Chair Powell, clearly inflation is unacceptably high. It's President Biden's top priority to bring it down. And Chair Powell has said that his goal is to bring inflation down while maintaining a strong labor market. That's going to take skill and luck, but I believe it's possible. I don't think a recession is inevitable.
So to dig into all of this a little bit more, I'm joined by my colleague Susan Tehrani, WION's correspondent in New York. She's live for us in the Big Apple. Susan, let me see if I've got this right. The President of the United States and his Treasury Secretary, both of whom a year ago batted away suggestions that inflation was going to be a substantial problem for the United States, now both say a recession is not inevitable, even though a growing number of CEOs and economists think that it is?
Right, Simon, it reminds me of the time when they said that inflation was going to be transitory, and here we are right now, many months later. Time and again, this administration has been trying to change the narrative on the economic problems that it has. And time and again, the American people have been very honest with the Biden administration, reflecting their frustration in poll after poll, saying that they're frustrated. They want to see a change in policy. But the administration continues to say, basically gaslighting the American people, and also now these CEOs that you mentioned. The 60% CEOs that now say that a recession is expected in the next 12 to 18 months. They say it's first due to higher energy prices. That's a particular concern, but it's also due to transportation costs. It's making it more expensive to produce goods. But these same executives, when they were polled back in January, only 18% of them said that a recession is inevitable. So it's a high priority, it's a high concern, not only among even people within the Biden administration's own party, not in his own administration, but among executives on Wall Street. And of course, American people are seeing it with their own eyes. So yes, it's very hard to sort of put these pieces together. And I think ultimately this administration has to come clean with the American people.
Susan, to be fair to the administration and to the Federal Reserve, interest rates are a pretty blunt instrument to try and use to deal with inflation. I mean, there aren't more precise instruments available to them. We've seen a 0.75 percentage point rise this month, suggestions that there might be a similar rise in interest rates next month. I mean, one of the downsides of all of that is that it's going to pour a bucket of cold water on the housing market, isn't it?
Absolutely. Anyone who wants to get a loan on a house, even a car, or anyone with a credit card is going to be affected one way or the other. Jerome Powell said regarding the housing market, because it's so highly, quote unquote, valued, it needs a reset, even signifying that if a recession would be underway, perhaps the housing market would see that kind of reset. I'm going to wait for this truck to pass by. However, it's going to be impossible for anyone, at least a first-time home buyer, with these high interest rates to go out and try to get a loan to buy a house at this point. Jerome Powell says that he's optimistic that by raising these interest rates, ultimately by the end of the year, that reset will happen. However, analysts at Moody's are saying that, if a recession does come, 5% decline in U.S. home prices, a 15% to 20% decline in significantly, quote unquote, overvalued housing prices. So you have, the high interest rates on the one hand, and then you have the recession playing into the housing market hand in hand on the other.
Tough times ahead. Susan Tehrani, live for us in New York. Susan, stay there. We're going to come back to you on another story momentarily. But first, we're going to take a look at another aspect of America's economic storm. Bitcoin, which has lost 57% of its value so far this year and 37% this month alone, remains on the edge. The world's largest cryptocurrency crashed last week as investors feared contagion from problems at major crypto players could unleash a major shakeout. It fell below $20,000 over the weekend for the first time since December 2020, adding to the nervousness of investors. The $20,000 mark is psychologically important. It was roughly the peak of the 2017 cryptocurrency cycle, signalling a recovery from a sharp drop on Saturday. Bitcoin yesterday rose around 7.6% in value to $20,004. The sell-off in the crypto market coincided with a slide in equities, as US stocks suffered their biggest weekly percentage decline for 2 years. Smaller cryptocurrencies have been even harder hit than major tokens, as investors sought the comparative safety of Bitcoin and stablecoins, whose values are pegged to those of traditional assets, most commonly the US dollar. The overall crypto market capitalization is roughly $870 billion. That's down from a peak of $2.9 trillion just last November. But even stablecoins market capitalizations have dropped in recent months, suggesting investors are pulling money from the sector as a whole. Now, travellers in the US have been subject to widespread flight disruptions over the last several days, leaving thousands of people stranded amid high air travel demand. In the last week, close to 19,000 flights have been cancelled or delayed. Airline companies blame the problems on COVID-19. It's laying their employees low. Those are, of course, exactly the same airline companies that insisted the government needed to lift its face mask mandate on board their aeroplanes. Bad weather has also contributed to the problems. New York City, Chicago and Atlanta are among the worst hit locations. Delta Airlines has been the worst affected, cancelling almost 1/3 of its flights over the weekend. Adding to the problem, the decision by thousands of pilots to seek early retirement at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pilots' union says the airlines failed to replace them in time. It's reported that US Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg met with top airline CEOs to discuss the challenges that the industry is facing and urged them to focus on performance improvements. Buttigieg added that he is considering punishing airlines with sanctions if they fail to live up to consumer protection standards. Ironically, a day after the conference was held, Buttigieg's own internal flight was cancelled, and he had to drive from Washington to New York City. So we return to New York City and to WION's correspondent there, Susan Tehrani. I mean, Susan, the White House can stamp its feet about this as much as it likes, but at the end of the day, these airlines are privately run companies. I mean, what, if anything, can the White House do to punish them for underperformance or for the kind of problems that the country is witnessing?
You know, this White House has a habit of punishing big corporations, or actually making the threat of constantly punishing organizations and corporations that provide service to the country. First, it was punishing oil companies. Now it aims to punish the airline industry, at least with threats. One of the reasons that the airline industry is facing these staff shortages was because of the policies of this administration in the beginning. First of all, a lot of the workers at these organizations like the airlines, for example, they received the COVID checks, the stimulus checks, and they decided to take a different path. You know, they had those savings. And then there were the policies of the vaccine policies where, there were the mandates. They got fired. They decided not to come back to work, so on and so forth. But there's only so much the government can do. They put in place, they're forcing them basically to hire people where a lot of people don't want to go back to work. Because they're not getting the benefits that they're getting in other industries. So I guess these airline companies can perhaps, raise, their wages, but at the end of the day, they have to make a profit as well. So sort of demonizing these private companies and corporations and taking a hands-off approach perhaps may not be the best way as to give them an incentive to better their performance. But, that's how this administration has been working and sort of taking a hands-off approach to everything and putting the blame on the other side.
Susan Tehrani, live for us on Two Stories today in New York City. We'll see you again later in the week. Thanks very much for that. Unionization efforts are gaining momentum at some large American companies after Amazon and Starbucks. Now a group of Apple workers in Baltimore have voted to unionize, and others are seeking to follow suit.
Workers at an Apple store in Maryland voted to unionize on Saturday, becoming the first employees of the tech giant in the U.S. to do so. The International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers said that more than 100 workers in Towson, near Baltimore, quote, overwhelmingly voted to join their union. The local workers, which formed the Coalition of Organized Retail Employees, said in a letter written to Apple CEO Tim Cook that they had, quote, the support of a solid majority of their co-workers. An Apple spokesperson told Reuters by email that they had nothing to add at this time. Unionization efforts are gaining momentum at some large U.S. corporations, including Amazon and Starbucks. Apple workers in Atlanta who were seeking to unionize withdrew their request last month, claiming intimidation. Some current and former Apple workers last year began criticizing the company's working conditions online using the hashtag Apple2.
While the West has sanctioned fuel imports from Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine, China's imports of oil from Russia rose to a record high in May. Last month, China's crude oil imports from Russia soared 55% from a year earlier. The world's second largest economy imported nearly 8.5 million tons of oil from Russia last month. That's nearly 2 million barrels a day. With record imports from Moscow, Beijing has surpassed its shipments from Saudi Arabia. Separately, China's imports of Russian liquefied natural gas amounted to nearly 400,000 tons last month. That's 56% more than the same month a year ago. Even though Moscow had to slash prices, it was still able to find buyers for its crude, despite Western sanctions. Russia is back to the top of the ranking of suppliers to China after a gap of 19 months. China is the world's biggest crude oil importer. Despite dampened overall crude oil demand due to COVID-19 curbs and a slowing economy, China's overall crude oil imports rose nearly 12% in May from a year earlier. Beijing has stopped short of condemning Moscow's war in Ukraine. China is also importing increasing quantities of crude from other nations facing sanctions. Beijing imported 250,000 tons of Iranian crude oil only last month. An International Monetary Fund team has held its first round of talks in Sri Lanka as the country continues to grapple with the worst economic meltdown in its history. Sri Lankan Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe welcomed the IMF team to his office. His finance secretary and the central bank governor also attended the talks. The IMF team will be in Sri Lanka until the end of the month, holding talks over the island nation's 17th financial rescue programme. The Prime Minister earlier said an IMF bailout is crucial if Sri Lanka is to secure bridge financing from other sources, including the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. In the last few months, Sri Lanka's foreign reserves have plummeted, inflation levels have multiplied exponentially, and the country is experiencing a shortage of everyday supplies. Public anger over that situation erupted over the weekend. There were clashes reported in Vishwamadu, 365 kilometres from the capital Colombo. The Sri Lankan military reportedly opened fire to contain rioting after reports of stone pelting and vandalism by unruly crowds. Authorities have said that 4 civilians and 3 soldiers were wounded. As economic conditions worsen in Sudan, farmers find themselves left with sacks of wheat that could soon start rotting in their own homes. It's a crisis caused after the Sudanese government backed out of promises to purchase the wheat at prices designed to incentivise crop production.
Looking at the sacks of wheat stacked in Modawi Ahmed's small warehouse, nobody would guess that Sudan's food security is hanging by a thread after an October coup and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, farmers fear that the grain will quickly rot after Sudan's cash-strapped authorities backed out of guarantees to buy it at a higher price. Modawi is one of thousands of farmers who have cultivated the grain as part of Sudan's largest agricultural scheme, named Al Ghazira.
The Agricultural Bank wants us to pay for our loans in wheat according to the encouraging price, which was set at 43,000 Sudanese pound, which is almost 88 euros. A farmer must register with the bank the quantity they will supply, and the bank will determine the quantity it will take. After calculating the loans, the bank will determine how much each farmer should supply in bags or kilos over a certain period of time. And if there is a surplus, they will shelf it, according to what we heard.
Sudanese officials declared in recent weeks that they will not be able to buy this season's entire harvest due to lack of funds.
No one wants to buy the wheat surplus, not as a strategic reserve, nor at the bank or the finance ministry. They have all refused. The issue has so many consequences.
The October coup derailed a fragile transition put in place following the 2019 ouster of President Omar al-Bashir. And the Ukraine war threatens to compound Sudan's existing food security troubles.
السلبي على المدى القريب هيحصل انه الناس هيكون في عزوف او عدم مقدره.
The negative consequences will start showing in the short term. People will refrain from using fertilizers and pesticides, or they won't be able to prepare or buy them. There will be a problem due to the depreciation of the Sudanese pound and the fact that farmers have no money.
Sudanese households are feeling the heat of spiraling fuel and electricity prices. Cost of staple food items have also skyrocketed, with inflation surpassing 200%. Given the economic crisis, the risk of farmers opting against cultivating wheat next season runs high.
And that's all we have time for on this Monday edition of WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Simon Marks. I'll see you back here at exactly the same time tomorrow for another edition of the programme. In the meantime, stay with WION for all your news updates. WION,
India's global voice.